accept enough people. So welcome everybody to this new Pathways Forum on the practical applications of social metabolism. So this forum is a part 2, following a previous one that explained the theory behind social metabolism and the general framework. So if you want to know more about the actual theory, you can go watch that session on the Pathways Initiative website or our YouTube channel, but preferably only once this one is finished. And so today, this forum is more about how the concepts that are related to social metabolism theory can be actually applied and concretely used in different contexts, scales, and uses. And so with that in mind, I'm very happy to welcome our 3 speakers today, which are Sabine Barle from the Panthéon-Sorbonne University in Paris, Cristina Madrid Lopez from the Autonomous University of Barcelona, and Juan Infante Ahmad from Granada University. And so as usual, this forum is divided into 2 parts. So the first hour is for our 3 speakers' presentations. So Sabine will start by presenting her work with Pyrensen on a regional level. And then Christina will continue by talking about the policy analysis that the Living Lab uses. And lastly, Juan will start talking more about the social metabolism framework that can be used more at an international level as well. So after each presentation, you will have 5 minutes to ask clarifying questions. So purely questions that are related to your understanding of the speaker's presentation. And you can keep all the more like discussion questions for later on, because the second part of this forum, so the last hour, is dedicated to having a more open discussion about their work. And so Colline Grimet will be leading and facilitating this second part of the forum. So without further ado, really, I will now leave the floor to our first speaker, Sabine Barle.
Excuse me, I didn't hear the last sentence because there was a motorbike in the street.
Well, that's okay. I was just saying, without further ado, I'll leave the floor to you now to start your presentation.
Okay, so it's time for me to speak. Okay, I'm going to share my screen. Really, no, ça va. I have lost my presentation. Where is it? Ah, yes. Okay, can you see the screen? Well, I just putting my chrono. And thank you very much for this invitation to speak in the Pathway Forum. I am going to say a few words about a research project about socio-ecological futures based on with scenarios we have been constructing with my colleagues. You have got the list of them here. And those scenarios, which are prepared at the regional scale, are based on the strong sufficiency hypothesis, sobriété in French. So just to go to more in depth, this work has been prepared within a research program, Pyrensen, who is concerned with the socio-ecological issues and especially water issues in the Seine basin in France. So you have this basin on the map on the left, right. What we wanted to do is to explore alternative scenarios for this basin up to 2050. The question was not to think more about the same basin than other regions, but we are in the same basin for this research program, so there is a kind of constraint. And there are 2 strong hypotheses within those scenarios. The first is that sufficiency is crucial to socio-ecological transition if we want to think about a sustainable socio-ecological regime within planetary boundaries. And the second one is that sufficiency can't be achieved without major political, economical, and social change. What I mean is that we are thinking about social metabolism. We are also thinking about policies, but first of all, we think about politics because it is much more important if we want to think about true sustainability. And in this context, we have imagined, but it is a serious imagination founded on a lot of reading, papers, interviews, and so on. The first one is called Cities in their Watershed, les villes en leur bassin. There is a S missing in French. And the second is post-metropolization, that is post-metropolisation in French. So now I'm going to explain the content of those scenarios and they shape in terms of social metabolism and regional metabolism in this case. Well, this is a big table. I am not going to say everything that is in the table. You can read it if you want, but I just want to say to tell the main characteristics of the scenarios. So the first one, cities in their watershed, les villes en leur bassin, is founded on a strong change in terms of politics, because we have imagined a shift to what would be the Sixth Republic in France, because now we are in the Fifth Republic, based on federal eco-socialism. And that is very important because in France, you know that we have a very strong presidential regime. So we thought that it was necessary to shift to this federal organization in order to improve socio-ecological conditions. We have also some hypotheses in terms of demography, which is the same as what is accounted for by our National Statistical Institute. But what is important in this scenario is that we imagine that the big metropolises don't grow anymore in France or elsewhere in Europe or elsewhere in the world, if we generalize it. And that what is very important is the growing role of medium cities, especially upstream from Paris urban area, where now there are shrinking cities, and we think that this new organization relies on local resources that make those medium cities much more important. And if we look now at the socio-ecological condition, this scenario is based on a metabolism that is mostly circular, so founded on sufficiency with a reduced technological interface. And what is very also important is a decrease in consumption, that is sufficiency in true words. And this decrease is founded on renunciation strategies if we compare it to present consumption. What makes possible the sustainability of this scenario is a strong change in farming system and diet with integrated organic crop livestock farming and less animal proteins, mainly renewable energy. And if we have to define, the relationship between human society and nature, we could sum up it with this sentence: we defend the planet for future generations. That would be a kind of sustainable development way. The other scenario is the post-metropolization. It is quite different in the terms of political regime, because we have imagined a complete change towards bioregional municipalism and completely direct democracy with abolition of private property, so something like an municipalist or anarchist scenario, with a strong redistribution of population among France and Europe. And as a consequence, the population of the Seine Basin is decreasing, but I must say that people don't die, they just move. And these moves are again all over Europe. And this new political regime is connected to a strong reflection upon sufficiency with a level of consumption that is not defined according to what was the level of consumption now, but which is defined with through a collective debate about what would be decent living conditions. This is also connected to an over-farming system and diet, less protein, animal proteins, agroforestry, and so on. And what we could say is that what we present this scenario is something regarding nature is we are nature defending itself. That is an idea of the unity of life between humans and non-humans. I am not commenting this, but I would just like to say that we have, of course, defined the way to go to this situation in 2050. So we have written the trajectories. And what I would like to show now is the result in terms of social metabolism. So what you can see here is the result in terms of nitrogen balance in the agri-food system. So nitrogen is very important because it is one of the most important limits of the planet. Today, it is one of the most transformed biogeochemical cycle. And the issues are numerous with nitrogen, first. And second, nitrogen is very important for us because it is what is in proteins. So when you eat proteins, you eat, and me too, nitrogen. And if you look at this picture here, it represents the present day situation of the circulation of nitrogen. From here, you've got agricultural land. Here it is the livestock, and here human consumption. This graph represents the situation with the eco-socialist scenario, and the last one with the municipalist one. And well, I understand that those graphs are very complicated. You just have to look at the lines, which are really thinner here than here. That means that there is less nitrogen needed to support population. And in the municipality scenario, it is also thinner and thinner. So what is important there is that with our change in agri-food system, with our changes in population distribution, land allocation, and so on, we are able to decrease considerably the level of nitrogen involved in food production, first. Second, we decrease the level of losses of nitrogen. What is in blue here? Those losses are losses to soil and water. Here it is wastewater. And so on. And you see that the losses are decreasing dramatically between the current situation and the two scenarios. And third, what is also very important is that our two scenarios show that it is possible to feed all the population of the basin with those agri-food systems. In the case of the eco-socialist scenario, you can see that it is always possible to export some food here. And in the municipality scenario, we have not been thinking about exporting food, but about having safety reserves. And here we have a 30% safety reserve that is quite important. That is a way to achieve territorial solidarity or to face climate problems. So this is for food. Now for energy consumption, we have here you've got also some figures about what is the present day consumption in France in primary and final energy. Here it is the eco-socialist scenario, and here's the municipalist one. We have used some works that have been made by other colleagues in order to choose these figures. One cities in the watershed is founded on the scenario prepared by Association Negawatt, a French association which thinks about energy transition. And for the municipalist scenario, we have been using a work by the colleagues who have defined some figures for decent living consumption. What we have, you can see the figure are very impressive because you see that we have a very strong decrease in energy consumption. It is in final energy terms, it is divided by 2 for the eco-socialist scenario and divided by 4 for the municipalist scenario. And here you can see how we achieve this. This is sufficiency, and here this is efficiency. And what you see is that most of the gain is through sufficiency, even if efficiency is increasing. Here you can see the result in terms of energy balance. Again, it is quite a mess in those graphs. Here it is the reference situation. So that means now, how do we use energy in the Seine basin? This one refers to the eco-socialist scenario, and this one refers to the municipalist one. And again, what we can see, if we compare to the nitrogen graphs I have shown previously, is the huge decrease in energy consumption. I have already mentioned this, but it is also quite a shift in the energy sources, with some difference between this scenario, eco-socialist, and the municipalist one, because with the municipalist scenario, we introduce animal traction, so that means that we need biomass, more biomass for for feed, in order to feed animals. And last but not least, how the results show that it is possible for the Seine basin to produce all this energy in order to make these ways of life possible. So that means that we don't have to use fossil fuels, just a little fossil fuels in the eco-socialist scenario, because we use them as a punctual source of energy when everything is missing. And in the municipalist scenario, we assume that there would be some intermittence in energy provision, but that this intermittence is embedded in ways of life, so it is not such a problem. We have been thinking about how people would live, so I have no time to comment, but if you want to have some discussion, I could say more thing about this. And if I go to my conclusion, what we can say in the end is that what we discovered making this work with a very interdisciplinary group of researchers is that those socio-ecological alternatives that can seem very utopian, I don't know, are feasible in terms of food production, energy production, and sustainable ways of life. But what we can see also is that it is, if we want to think about those alternatives, it is really necessary to take into consideration a large set of variables, and especially the political dimension, but also population distribution, socio-technological systems, and ecological characteristics. And to emphasize the role of sufficiency, I have said a lot about this. And also, if we want to think about a true transition, it would be necessary to think outside of the traditional box and to admit political change as a necessity, or the decrease in farming land, and so on. And I would say at the last word that the reception of our scenario is very diverse, especially the second one, which is a municipalist. And I thank you for your attention. If you're interested in these scenarios, you can download them at this address, but this is in French. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation, Sabine. So we can now have a few minutes of clarifying questions if people in the participating have some. So you can either put them in the chat or lift your hands up if you want. Okay, yeah, that's so William Malherbe, you can.
Hi, thank you, Sabine. Thank you, everyone. That's a very interesting presentation. I'm also interested in scenarios and future scenarios. So I'd like to ask if the hypotheses that you posed in the initial slides, if that informed the formation of your scenarios, or if, yeah, just what they were based on in those two different scenarios, if it was based on those hypotheses that you had. Thank you.
So in fact, we have prepared those two scenarios in different conditions. The first one was following a debate we had about, is it possible to feed everybody in the same basin with organic farming?
Okay.
And we first, and my biogeochemist colleagues first made the calculation that showed that it was possible. And then we discussed about what would be the political, social, economical organization that would make this possible. And for the second scenario, it was quite different. We took in consideration the fact that today we can observe some initiatives, local ones, by some people in écolieux, I don't know the word in English, but who try to develop alternative ways of life. And we said, well, let's imagine that these alternative ways of life spread all around the basin and France and so on. Would it be feasible in biogeochemical energy terms? And then we went to the answer that it is a yes. So it is quite different from one to another. Here I packed them and I made a reconstruction a posteriori to make it more scientific, but it was not like that in the true life.
Thank you. Still very interesting. Thank you.
Is there any other quick questions? If not, I think we thank you very much for your presentation, Sabine, and we can go to the next one, to our next speaker.
Do you want me to share the screen?
Yep, yep, you can share your screen now.
Okay. Can you see it well?
Yep. Yes.
Okay. I'm gonna close the video so I won't see you. Hi everyone, thank you for the invitation to present the work that we do at the research group that I coordinate. I'm Cristina Madrid Lopez. I am the PI of a research group called the Living Lab, hosted at the Institute of Environmental Science and Technology, ICTA, at the Autonomous University of Barcelona in Spain. We depart from an idea in the group that is that the energy transition is actually a wicked problem. And as such, we have very high stakes. There is a lot in this game, and there are very likely many solutions depending on which angle you are seeing. It's difficult to sit together and agree on which solution is the best. However, we must find a way. We must find a pathway to continue because it is very important for the whole society. So a few years ago, we ran this very nice project called Sentinel. And within the project, we went ahead and asked energy modelers and policymakers and the general public, we went and asked, what do you think that we need to include in the modeling for the energy transition? And regarding environmental impacts, they gave us this. They told us, okay, we need you to model raw materials and how they are circular and how they are reused. We need you to model nature and biodiversity impacts. We need you to consider all the impacts of the energy transition, not only those that are on site. And we also need you to model the emissions, which are the ones causing the energy, the climate change, right? But observe how they are not the first priority. And then they also talk about the human health and other annoying impacts of the energy transition, and land use was somehow repeated with nature and biodiversity, Then we asked them why are they important, and they told us that they are key to do proper decision making, because we were designing pathways for the energy transition that were not considering very important constraints. They also
Je
told
suis en
us.
train de regarder exactement. Alors, attends, je viens de voir ton. Yomo? Non. Ah si, attends, je te suis dessus.
Attention, il y a quelqu'un qui parle.
Okay. They also told us that more information will enable to connect different policies, not only to do energy and climate policy like we do now in Europe, but to do energy, water, land, climate policies, or at least to make them more coherent with one another. And they also told us that it will facilitate the empowerment of the people, because very often people who are next to energy transition installations, renewable energy installations, don't know a lot about the impacts they may find in the future. So we have this nice work, if I may say so, that I invite you all, if you want to have for reference, when we advocate for the need of including more social and environmental factors in energy modeling in general and in energy policy. So how to model this, right? Because we are saying that the energy transition is complex and it is wicked. And then on top of that, we not only want to model energy systems, but we also want to include ecosystems and other social systems related to that, right? Okay, so this is a proposal that we have in the group. It's a methodology that we have put in the form of a software, a Python package, if you are familiar with modeling. And what we do is to depart from the assessment of a certain technology, from the engineering point of view, if you like, and we think about how this is designed, the resources that you need for these technologies, and the impact that single technology will cause. But then we not only focus on the place where the technology is, but we assess all the life cycle of that technology. So if we see this wind turbine and all the rest of the infrastructure that is related to that, the substations, the transmission lines, and how they arrive to homes and it's used, we will not only take into account the operation of those, but also how we manufacture them, how we do the material extraction, how we transport them, and even after their useful life, what do we do with them? No, it is very well known that wind blades, wind turbine blades are made out of glass fiber, very difficult to recycle afterwards. Then once that we understand all of these impacts, we just call the metabolism framework. And then we say, okay, we have all of these for a single technology, but this technology has a function within the society. So we cannot just simply stop it. And we assess the accumulated impacts of the different technologies in relation to the function they have. This means that we will compare the supply of energy and the impact associated to the supply of energy with the demand of energy, and we will see if the impact, you could say, if they worth it somehow, no? If you think about it, the structure I'm representing here is actually one way to do a pathway. You can do a certain share of different technologies in different pathways, no? So we indeed not only analyze one single pathway, but typically we assess the results of energy optimization models that will give you 400, 500 designs or 500 pathways to reach a particular percentage of an X scenario with different mixes of technologies. So what I wanted to show you is with this methodology is what we do in two related projects. The first one is called the Living Project. It's actually our flagship, the one that gives name to the group, and is funded by the Spanish government. In the Living Project, we assess the Spanish NECP, we call it PENIEC, in which the Spanish government has established a scenario in which 81% of the electricity will be produced with renewable sources. But we ask ourselves, okay, if impacts are located in the space, how do we model the impacts geographically, and who is going to be closer to those impacts? So what we have done is, on the one hand, disaggregate each one of the stages of those technologies, as I mentioned before: photovoltaic, wind, hydropower, pumped hydro. And we also included current fossil fuels, nuclear, and others who are currently in use. And we disaggregated the impact. You can see here in the left side, we disaggregated those impacts that happens at the place where the technology is. So in the wind park, in the power station, in the thermic station. And we separated those of the impacts that are not happening on that site. And we ask ourselves if maybe we are just saving some impacts on site to put the impact somewhere else, and what will be those impacts. Here is an example of the result. One of our conclusions on this project was we are reducing indeed impacts of sites. We are reducing impact on site where the technology is. So clearly a photovoltaic, a thermosolar station, or a wind park, they do not have any emissions, but with the current energy mix, the emissions will be located where the manufacturers are. And we also observe how you can see here, let me first start by explaining you this graph. So in the y-axis, you have the share of on-site of sites. So that means that impacts that are at the top of the chart have a higher percentage of off-site contribution. And in the x-axis, you have the variation of the PENIEC scenario, potential scenario with respect of the current situation right now, no? So you see that when we reduce impacts, this is the corner that you can see down left, you see that we have different types of impacts related to these categories here, and they are mostly the impacts that are on site. And in the upper right corner, even though we also have a few in the upper left, there are impacts that we are increasing with regards to the current situation, but they are mostly off-site. No? And I have highlighted two things here is that the wind and the solar photovoltaic have a high contribution on ecotoxicity, which is one of the indicators we use to assess the impacts over ecosystems. And then they also have, as I think it's very obvious, no, a higher material use because it's a technology that we have to produce and install from scratch. Then we also have land use impacts, mostly based on the increased use of biomass in that proposed scenario, and also in the increased use of land by photovoltaic. So this was one separation, one way to use the metabolism approach. And then here I have another example coming from a project called Just Wind for All. This one is funded by the European Union. It's a Horizon Europe project in which we assess only onshore and offshore wind energy. In this project, we are not assessing a national plan. What we are assessing is different scenarios which have been co-designed with different actors in which we are trying to achieve this expectation, this forecast of the European Technology and Innovation Platform on Wind Energy. We are currently of a contribution of wind energy of about maybe 10 to 20%, and the hope is that by 2050, wind energy will provide 50% of the energy of the electricity will demand. So what we do in the project is we try to create new methods. The part that I coordinate, the work package I coordinate concretely, we look for a more holistic assessment, which is based on the idea of socio-ecosystem metabolism, considering that we are not only hoping for a sustainable transition or for a sustainable pathway, but also for a just pathway, no? I am going to present a part of the work that one of the students, our PhD students in the group is working on, Mikel, and he developed a parametric model to assess the data. So one of the trouble we face sometimes and very often is that we do not have the data to do our modeling. Assessing the metabolism requires data on so many different aspects of reality that very often we do not have that. So if you are familiar with life cycle assessment, there is a part of that that has to do with inventory data, and this is the material requirements for each of the technologies. So what Mikel has done is to create a model in which once that you give the capacity of the wind turbine and the height and other technical aspects, you can model the material demands for each one of the life cycle stages of that turbine. Once we have that information, we put it in this EnVios framework and Python package that I mentioned before, and then we calculate the impacts. And we have done that for onshore wind power, but we are working on repowering and also offshore wind power. So one of the things that we can get with this type of assessment is a comparison between different technologies. Here you can see a comparison between different turbines, and I'm sorry because I realized I have deleted the legend with the colors, but the darker the color is, the more capacity the technology has. So that means that the highest impacts are coming from turbines that have more capacity. When you map in this way, you can assess the function that this technology is giving you. For example, the ability to produce more or less electricity with the same amount of wind versus the different impacts they are creating. So again, photovoltaics are on top of the water consumption, and they are also on top of effects on biodiversity. And this is so because of the amount of land they occupy versus, for example, wind turbines. another thing that you can do with this approach is to map where the impacts are, and then you locate these against where the people live. If you observe this map that is showing you the land use associated or the biodiversity impact associated to new wind power installations in Europe, you will, and you compare this with the population density map, you will see how most of the proposed areas or most of the expected areas to produce more wind power are actually located in zones where the electricity will not be consumed because we do not have a lot of population. We do have, of course, a few examples, but the general tonic would be that that we are somehow displacing the impacts to regions where not a lot of people live. We have also observed that this transition pathway will likely affect mostly rural communities in which political power is lower. So how do we make a sense out of all this data? So let me just show you this metrics framework that we use. And let me see if I can, you can see now. So basically, we depart from the idea that we have a wind park. This is a case for the Tramontana Park in the northeastern of Spain. This park is contributing to the energy sector, which is contributing to the Spanish economy. The Spanish economy is also maintained in that region, or the local economy, is also maintained by the agricultural and the fishing sectors, and also by tourism. Directly, the Tramontana Park does not have any impact on these sectors. However, if you look at the social ecosystem and how this park will affect different functions and ecosystem services, you see that the Tramontana Park has what is called a wake effect that stops the wind. This wind may affect how the sea in the region moves, how the phytoplankton moves as well, and how the trophic web is currently structured. And that case will affect the fisheries and also the tourism sector. So this is I just wanted to give you a couple of examples. I do not have any conclusions because this is just the ways in which we can use the assessment, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have. Here you have the components of the lab, which we are 8 people currently, and if you have any questions, please feel free to ask them or to reach out.
Thank you for your presentation. Does anyone have any clarifying questions before we go to the last speaker? If not, I think we can go to our last speaker. So Juan, you can start sharing your screen. Thank you very much, Christina.
Okay, thank you. Well, can you see the screen?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, thank you. Well, thank you very much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to participate in this seminar. Well, in my presentation, I will speak about the theory of ecological unequal exchange in general terms, but with a particular focus on the case of Latin America. Although I assume many of you are familiar with the notion of ecologically unequal exchange, I will start by a brief review of its origin, its propositions, and the existing empirical evidence. And I anticipate that this evidence is still very limited from a historical perspective. And in this sense, I will present the results of several studies I'm conducting on the case of Latin America in historical perspective. And I will conclude with brief remarks on the need to expand historical studies on biophysical exchanges. So the theory of ecologically unequal exchange is relatively recent. The first work that formally proposed it was under developing the Amazon by Banker in 1985, but later in the 90s, more works were published that formally conceptualized this theory. And it emerged as an hybrid of critical development theories like unequal exchange, world systems theory, or dependency theory, combined with the new ecological perspectives. The basic premises of this theory, broadly speaking, are that as ecological economic poses economic system, we know that the economic system are embedded in a material world. Modern economic growth is dependent on the use of natural resources. So wealthy countries have greater material demands that they cannot always meet with their own resources. So sometimes or many times they import those resources from third countries. And additionally, we know that physical flows provide better information than physical flows and physical accounting, better information than monetary flows and accounting about the environmental impacts. So the extraction of materials, even those of low value, generates local and global environmental impacts. Okay, that said, the ecologically unequal exchange theory posits that there is a net transfer of biophysical flows quantified in raw materials, land, energy, and other impacts in international trade. However, I have to say that there are different variations of this theory. For example, in the literature, you can find much more ambitious and critical proposals that, in addition to the previous definition that I have just given, incorporate other elements. For example, on the drivers, sometimes it is indicated that these unequal relations are explained by unequal power dynamics, for instance, military power influencing international organizations and so on. And on the other hand, sometimes this literature goes further with the impacts, suggesting that ecologically unequal exchange explains not only unequal resource use, but also economic development gaps between countries. It is explained in the Great Divergence. Basically, this idea that the growth of the north, of the global north, occurs at the expense of the peripheral countries. So what do we know? What is the empirical evidence today? Although numerous theoretical and empirical papers have been published in the last 30 years, evidence on resource transfer between countries was limited until very recently. Actually, in a recent paper, it was stated this, that the empirical evidence to support the theory is still very scarce. However, recently, with the emergence of the so-called environmental extended multi-regional input-output tables, it has been possible to quantify the resources and impacts embedded in global value chains. So these new and very powerful databases provide information on resources and impacts within value chains, identifying the origin of extraction, where the impact occurs, and also the final place of consumption, where the responsibility lies. And here you can see the results of a recent paper using this kind of estimates. And it highlights that high-income countries are net importers of materials, energy, land, and labor. These and many other studies also conclude that if ecologically unequal exchange is understood as the net transfer of resources and impacts from poorer to richer countries, the evidence drawn from these new powerful databases supports the theory. So poorer countries bear the brunt of extraction and its associated problems, while the wealthier countries enjoy more materials without enduring the impacts of extraction. However, this data is only available from the 90s. So in consequence, the historical empirical evidence is still very limited. Although, as far as I understand it, this is absolutely fundamental. I mean, this theory does not only aim to explain current trade relations, but to some extent it promises an explanation of historical change, and especially in its more ambitious versions, it suggests that power relations explain unequal exchange, which in turn explain environmental and economic inequalities. So to properly answer these questions in the screen, I think that we need solid historical evidence. Of course, the ecological unequal exchange literature is paying a lot of attention to historical issues. I mean, you have here very clear examples in these books, in these fantastic books, and the importance of its study is acknowledged in this literature. So among its scholars, there are very interesting works that have analyzed ecological exchange relations from a historical perspective. However, to date, this has been necessarily done with fragmented and local evidence of these patterns. There is good evidence in the literature on economic and environmental history, which does not necessarily follow a theoretical ecologically unequal exchange perspective. For example, the famous work on the Great Divergence by Kenneth Pomeranz quantified, among many other things, the amount of land embodied in England's import in the 19th century. And as you can see in this chart, it is estimated that the land imported by England was larger than the country's agricultural land. So with this evidence, Pomeranz concluded that without this relief, without this land relief, not only the UK, but Europe would have suffered a Malthusian catastrophe. But however, other historical evidence challenges the assumptions of ecologically unequal exchange. Some authors have shown that rich countries were in the past also net exporters of resources, energy, or emissions. And more importantly, and this is going to be a key point in my presentation, it is often repeated, even within the critical literature, that the volume of materials in international trade was very limited in the past. And as a result, the transfer of impacts would have been minimal and especially localized. In any case, to this day, we do not have macro-level evidence on biophysical exchanges in history. This is a huge gap. Well, next, I will show preliminary results from a study in which we are reconstructing different biophysical indicators for the case of Latin America from a historical perspective, and what new insights I believe they bring to the debates on ecologically unequal exchange. Specifically, I will focus on trade data for raw materials and land in the case of Latin American countries. This first chart shows the physical trade of materials following the material flow accounting methodology, which is an harmonized methodology, and which groups materials resources in, and sorry, this is in Spanish, group the resources into biomass, fossil fuels, metals, and construction materials. So we can see that the region has always been a net exporter, that there is a shift in specialization, first from biomass, then to oil, then to metals, and today to a diversified profile. We see that current levels are unprecedented in history. In fact, current exports may be higher than those during more than 3 centuries of colonial rule. But as I will discuss later, this does not imply that current impacts are greater. Finally, we see an apparent growth process, no? Within this context of the great acceleration. This growth and the high current levels suggest that the past trade was limited. I mean, however, if we analyze the growth in relative terms, we see that the highest annual growth rates occurred a century ago. Actually, during the so-called fast globalization, we can see that growth was higher than in the recent, for instance, commodity boom in the 21st century. When analyzing the different national patterns, we observe two interesting elements. First, although the region as a whole is a net exporter of resources, not all countries were net exporters. In fact, most, as you can see here, most Central American countries, those with lower levels of development, are net importers of all types of materials, and also tend to be net importers of land. So unequal exchange in these countries is likely expressed in other forms, for example, through precarious work, violence, or the use of agrochemicals, but not with the conventional biophysical indicators used in this literature. And secondly, we observe different patterns of specialization. In this chart, the y-axis differentiates whether a country is an importer or exporter of minerals, so the subsoil resources, and the x-axis whether it is importer or exporter of land-based resources, and that is agricultural products. And we observe a clear spatial pattern of specialization that seems to be determined by resource endorsements. For example, the southern cone countries, Argentina, Uruguay, Paraguay, exports agricultural products but imports minerals, while the Andean countries exports minerals and imports land. Very briefly, in this chart, I want to show that extractive patterns have changed throughout history, and that this profile is not only determined by resource endowment, by the cyclical demands of the global economy in history. At the beginning of the century, when most countries were dependent on land-based products to meet the majority of needs, most exports were agricultural. Later, with the growing of global demand of fossil fuels, the extractive pattern changed, and we are currently in a new transition where the demand of agricultural products is growing faster in the context of the so-called new competition for land. Now I will briefly show the results for land. This chart shows the evolution of cropland in Latin America. It has increased from 23 to 150 million hectares in the past century. But however, what we have quantified is the land embodied in trade. And we see that a significant part of that cropland is designated for export. The land exported has increased from 7 to 87 million hectares. So, as some authors suggest, trade seems to have been very limited in historical periods. However, what we find is that this is not really the case, because in relative terms, as much land was exported a century ago as is exported today. So at the beginning of the 20th century, more than 50% of domestic cropland was already exported, as more or less as it is today. So why is this? And this is one of the more important conclusions in this research. Certainly, the volume exported, was smaller in the past, but the impact per unit of product was much higher. A century ago, more land, but also more energy, labor, precarious work, and forced labor, for instance, was required per unit of product. In other words, the impacts embodied in international trade are much higher than we assume. Okay, finally, I'm going to show you some data on the bilateral flows, in this case for the land trade. And indeed, we can see that at the beginning of the 20th century, most of the land flowed to European centers, as we expected. And within Europe, we see that it was flowing to its wealthiest industrialized countries like, for instance, England. So what is happening today? A significant part still flows to Europe, but as you can see here, 45% of the land is now flowing to Southeast Asia, particularly to China, which is playing a key role in today's global economy. Just very brief concluding remarks. So if theory of ecological unequal exchange, understood as asymmetric flows between rich and poor countries, has been, I think that it has been well tested for recent periods. But I'd say that it is not only, we have to keep in mind that it is not only a matter of GDP, because we also know that resource endowment is also explanatory in this tale. For instance, within high-income countries, Australia, Canada, or the USA depicts lower net imports than Japan or the European Union with higher population densities. If this theory aspires to a more ambitious definition that includes power as a driver factor of unequal exchange, or that is behind economic inequality between countries, by the way, this is contested by mainstream economic historians today, I think that it is necessary to improve the quantitative evidence from a historical perspective. The very limited evidence from this case of Latin America suggests that against the idea that trade was limited in the past, I mean, this is true, but what we see is that the impact per unit of production was greater. So historical environmental transfers may be significantly higher than we thought. In the light of the narrative of the Great Acceleration, what we see is the growth rates were higher a century ago than they are now. We also see, and this is important, I think, that as historians know, history is not teleological, history is not linear, there is no long march in history. We find spatial and temporal discontinuities. In relation to the spatial differences, I mean, there are some evidence that challenge the theory. Although Latin America is a net exporter, we find that poorer countries within the region are net importers of land, energy, and materials. Of course, we think that they likely internalize other impacts, such as forced labor, violence, or many other impacts, but this needs to be studied. And in relation to the patterns of specialization change by country, we see that the historical dynamics play a key role. I mean, the early 20th century, the key exports were land-based products. We were in a context in which most world countries depended on land-based products to meet their needs. In the central decades of the century, we see a boom in the case of the oil and in the case of metal mining, in a context of a new, different, I mean, economic system. And today we see that in the context of the new competition for land, with increasing demands of biomass, we find a diversified extractive patterns. So what we see is that, I mean, history also play a role here in this tale, because the extractive patterns also depend in the historical context. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your presentations. I think we have time for one or two short clarifying questions before we go to the discussion part of this forum. So Christina has a question. I didn't know whether you want to say out loud or if you want me to read it.
Sure, I can ask. Juan, thank you for the presentation. I just to clarify, did I understand well that you say that the intensities for material use have decreased or increased? There was this slide with the two charts, with the two curves.
Well, thank you for the question, Christina. In terms of product, it has decreased. I mean, we needed much more land and labor in the past. Okay, but in that chart, what I showed was the percentage of the domestic cropland devoted to export. So what I find is that at the beginning of the 20th century, it was 50% more or less, which is the current value, but it decreased in the central decades of the 20th century, and that is explained by the collapse of international trade because of the world wars, the financial crisis, and also by the internal policies in Latin America that tended to, to reduce the imports to the rest of the world.
Any other questions? I think we can now get to the discussion part of this forum. And so Colleen Grimet will be moderating this discussion. So I'll leave the floor to her now.
Thank you, Rosie. Yes, so we can go into questions that are a bit more relating the three presentations together. So if you have any questions, don't hesitate to either raise your hand or write them in the chat, and either I will read them or I will give you the floor if you want. So yeah, don't hesitate and don't be shy. But maybe to get us kickstarted, I can start with a question. So I'm the first to jump in the water. I was wondering, and it's really a question for the three of you. Social metabolism, in a way, allows us to paint a fuller picture of material extraction and exchanges than what classical or neoclassical economic theories do. But at the same time, it also requires to think and make more choices on the indicators used and the scales we look at, and the scales in terms of spatial spaces, but also in temporalities. So I was wondering for each of you what factors guided or still guide these questions and these choices in your research projects. How do you make these choices?
I go. Okay. Thank you very much, and thank you very much, both of you, for your presentations that were very interesting. For me, my first interest, even if I have been speaking about the Seine Basin, is a city. And what I have been working on, among other things, is to understand what is the remote impact of cities. And in order to stress the fact that you can't think about urban environment, without thinking about what is occurring elsewhere. And it is quite important because now most of people know this, but people who work on cities are a little too much city-centered. And I have a trend to forget that cities are completely depending on all other territories. So that would be my scale of research. But I think that what is important to finish is to have multi-scale approaches. That means that, well, if the focus is the city, it is very important to look at what is occurring outside the city. But as we have seen just now, we can also see what is the impact of cities in the basin, in the country, in Europe, if we are in France, or in the world. And it is very important to always, and I am going to finish because I am thinking while speaking, so it is difficult. For me, what is important is to have in mind that things occur somewhere. What I mean is that it is not only a material flow, it is somewhere this flow has been initiated and there has been impacts, and this place is relevant. And the most interesting things we can do is to try to locate these places. And I have finished. Excuse me, it was too long.
I can add to that, Juan, unless you want to say something. So I am in the more nerdy side of the metabolism assessment, in the computing side, and we work a lot with the idea of fit for purpose, understanding that no model is right, that all models are wrong and they have failures, and that they show us only one part of that reality, that we are making assumptions for the rest, because you have to fix something in order to study something else that is changing. So maybe this idea that being a little bit humble and understanding that we move in what we can call post-normal science framework, and that the choices that we make will affect the results, and trying to be transparent about it. But mostly it's about the question that you have that will help me or us decide about the levels of assessment or the indicators or anything.
Well, thank you for the question. I think that not only in social metabolism studies, but in general in environmental studies, the selection of indicators and therefore the methodologies is more complex than in conventional economic analysis, because the impacts, environmental impacts, are multidimensional. So we cannot solely only rely on economic values. There are impacts on climate, on land systems, biological flows, and I think they are all relevant. But in my particular case, when studying history, in the case of historical studies, and I'd say that all are relevant, but one of particular interest to me is the case of land. I mean, because in the past, until very recently, land was the main resource to meet most of the necessities. I mean, particularly not only in the pre-industrial age, but until, I mean, at the beginning of the 20th century. Land played a key role not only for feeding people, but also for providing fuel and raw materials. I mean, a large part of our need with land. It was a key resource for providing materials, but I mean, it also was behind of most environmental impacts until very recently. So, I mean, that's what I'd say.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's true that in any case, thinking about the boundaries and the scope of your research is important in every sort of research, especially if you want to be transparent about any hidden assumptions in a sense. So it's interesting to see how maybe social metabolism forces you to be transparent about it, and to make these choices. So I think that's quite interesting. Do we have any other questions from anyone else? Rebecca, do you want to ask your question?
Yes, thanks, and thanks a lot for organizing this and for the presentations, which I really enjoyed. My question relates to something that Sabine said at the very end of her presentation, where you said that the reactions to this are very diverse. So I wanted to ask if you could elaborate a bit on that, especially since I can imagine that people's or even other researchers' reactions to those kind of ideas, which can be perceived as quite radical, can indeed be very diverse. So I wanted to ask you, Sabine, but also the others, what your experience is with this kind of work.
Okay, thank you very much for your question. The fact is that at the beginning, we had another scenario that was something like business as usual. And that was very bad for everything, and especially water, ecosystems, and so on, but also people. And we had this business as usual plus the eco-socialist one. And people, and especially those who come to the conference of the Pure Sen, which occurs every year, and who are people who are funding our research, they were quite skeptical about the eco-socialist scenario, cities in the watershed. And after we added the third one, the municipalist one, and those who were skeptical about the eco-socialist scenario became quite interested in it, because they thought that the municipalist one was too awful. I don't know if I am clear enough. That means that by proposing a completely revolutionary scenario, we have made acceptable the reformist scenario. This is for those who are who don't accept major changes. There are other reactions that are very positive for the third scenario, because it is, for some people, it is a kind of hope, but because it says that we could live, we could have enough food, enough energy with those hypotheses. Of course, everything it is much more complicated than I have said, but so it for some people it is something that brings hope, and for others something that for some people this is impossible to think about just using 20 liters of water every day or something like that. So, well, it is a political position in the end. And but I'm not knowing if I am clear. So that's it.
Thank you for the question. I was just thinking, when I started to work as a researcher 20 years ago, it was more difficult to grasp these ideas of metabolism. But I was surprised last year, as we were actually told, I was actually told, but this is not related to economics at all. And it was really fun. It was kind of sad to see how things haven't changed a lot within mainstream economics. Like these things are still considered not economics in many places. But mostly the work that we do in the group is to assess energy models, which are designed by, most of the time, general equilibrium models, or energy systems designed by general equilibrium models or input-output analysis very often. And then what I found is that the policymakers or even the technical teams behind those models in the policy, in the administration, are very keen on including this. They don't know how to. So I think it's up for us to make this effort and trying to communicate with them, because I have seen in the administration more openness to include these other parameters and indicators that we assess that I have seen in academia, particularly in economics.
Thank you. Juan, did you also have something to add, or not?
Well, could you repeat the question? Sorry, I didn't know it was a question for me. Sorry.
I think Rebecca's question was linked to Sabine's presentation, but also addressed to everyone, on how the work is being received. And because Sabine was saying that the work that she has been doing on Pierre and Sen was received in many different ways, and received many different directions, reactions, not directions. So yeah, maybe how has your work been received in the community, but maybe also a bit wider?
Okay, thank you. And sorry about it. Well, wow, what a question. Well, because I work in the Department of Economic History, but I also do research on ecological economics. So when I need dialogue with ecological economists, I have no problem at all to communicate, to disseminate my research, because what I am basically doing is the same than they do, but adding the historical perspective. And I think that it is usually interesting for them, not only for knowing the past, but because many environmental impacts today, for instance, in the case of climate change, can only be explained by, I mean, the cumulative activities that we have done in the past. I mean, it has that interest. And there are not many historical reconstructions for many, I mean, environmental impacts or socio-metabolic indicators. So I think that it is of interest. But yes, the story is quite different when I have to dialogue with my economic historians colleagues. I mean, economic history relies on conventional economic methodologies. They are not very familiar at all with these biophysical indicators. And yes, I think that we don't even have any debate because, I mean, it is very difficult to establish the dialogue. When I go to economic history forums, what I try to say in order to convince them on the importance of this kind of research is that economics has incorporated the environment or the geography in data analysis as an explanatory variable of economic growth. I mean, it's how the environment affects economic development, and the economic historians do the same. But they have not paid attention to the other relation. So how the economy is affecting the environment. So that is what I try to sell when going to more conventional economic forums, no? Saying that, I mean, it is not only to see how the environment is determining the economy, but how the economy is determining the environmental impact. That is something usually done by ecological economists, but not commonly done within the conventional economics.
Thank you. Are there any further questions? If you, yeah, questions or comments. And if you prefer to write them in the chat because you don't want to take the floor, also don't hesitate to share what this inspires with you as well. Otherwise, I actually have another question that it's a bit related to what you just said, well, Juan and Christina actually, but in a sense, the work you do is, I would say, inherently interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary. And I was wondering how you navigate this interdisciplinarity in your research projects. I mean, Juan, you were saying that speaking with more classical historians of economic historians can be a bit difficult, but in a sense, the work the three of you are doing is you inherently need the perspectives from different disciplines, and you need to be as well in relation with other fields that are maybe non-academic. So I was wondering how you navigate this. It's quite a wide question, but I think one of the aims of the Pathways Initiative is also to help researchers find their way in this messy, interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary worlds of transformative science. So maybe you have some insights and tips to share.
Who begins?
I've scared them.
Okay, so I go. Well, I think that regarding my situation, I have quite an interdisciplinary background, as I was trained as an engineer, and after I have the master in history of technology and in urban planning. So it was, for me, it was quite natural to navigate, like you said, but in the end, it is quite difficult. I think that you can only navigate with people who want to navigate with you. And it is exactly what said when you meet people who don't want to go out of their way of thinking, it is unnecessary. It is nearly unnecessary to try. They won't change, or you have to do a very big work to do so. I remember once I was at a conference about energy history, and I presented some preliminary results about energy in the Pyrenees during the 19th and 20th century. And there were economic historians there, very classical, and they were, comment on dit? Outrés? Outrés, comment on dit? Outrés?
Outraged.
Outraged. Because they thought that it was absolutely stupid to speak about a transition from biomass to hydropower in terms of consequences upon the landscape and so on. What they told me is that you have to speak about growth and the fact that it was a way to put the Pyrenees into the progress and so on. And it was very caricatural, and it made me think and remember that there were still people like that. And second thing, I think that you have to find people who want to do it, and there must be an horizontal, is it? Way of working. In my experience, when you have a research project which is very much embedded, for instance, in biogeochemistry, with a little social sciences, it does not really work. It is really better when everybody is at the same level of involvement, because it helps to engage in discussing and so on. That's it.
Thank you.
I can chip into that, but so if you have seen when I presented everyone involved in the work that we do in the team, there was the disciplines of each of them, and each of them speak a different language. So I know that there are two requisites. First, that the team comes from different places, and second, that you choose to work with people that will be open to work with you. And I have a similar background like Sabine. I'm an environmental scientist, which is more earth, but then it's also a little bit of social sciences and engineering. Then my master's was in economic history and economic institution in ecological economics. Then my PhD was in industrial ecology, which is more engineering. And you see who's willing to discuss and who's not. And unfortunately, in academia, or at least in Spanish academia, I don't know if Juan agrees with me, but interdisciplinarity is not well recognized just yet. So you will talk about interdisciplinarity as being the panacea to the problems and what we need, but then you go to a department of economics and they want an economist, and the department of engineering, they want an engineer. They do not want someone who does both. So there is a challenge. I think there is a challenge that from the people doing metabolism assessment are typically people who mix backgrounds, and there is a challenge that we as a community have to face. And hopefully, with the support of ecological economics, human ecology, and other international societies, we can just give it a push and make a better academia. I do see that, though, that I feel like a grandma now, but I do feel like younger people have a more open mind to work with people who's not from their disciplines, or at least this has been my experience. And the team, we like, the age average is really low. They are all PhD students, and you can see that it's easier this way. At least this is my personal observation. Good question, though.
Yes, very good question. Well, in relation to the interdisciplinary, I mean, in terms of the research process, I firmly believe in collaborative research. I mean, I think that's absolutely mandatory. I also have a interdisciplinary background. I was trained as an economist. I did a master in agroecology and then a PhD in environmental history. But yet, when I have to deal with a paper that combines historical economics or climate issues, for instance, I think that I need to collaborate with real expert on every specific topic. So I am used to collaborate with different people, not only with my same background, but with different backgrounds to make sure what we are doing is correct. I think that is a really important thing. It doesn't happen in all research disciplines. For instance, historians tends to publish alone without co-authorships. And I think I usually tell them that that is very risky, because if historians, I mean, want to do something on climate or any other environmental aspect, I mean, you cannot become an expert on that from one day to another. You are ultimately being an amateur environmental scientist. So I think that this collaboration is crucial for doing this kind of research. And just a comment on what Cristina said, I couldn't agree more on this of the interdisciplinarity in Spain. But yes, I'd say that in the interdisciplinary research in Spain is highly promoted, but only in theory. Because, I mean, when it comes, for instance, to project evaluations, they are always asking for interdisciplinary research. But when it comes to project evaluations or to the formation of the departments, of the research areas at the national level, I mean, it doesn't happen at all. Actually, I think that we are penalized when you do interdisciplinary research in the case of Spain, yes, unfortunately.
I see. Yeah, thank you for the comments. I think it's definitely something that we can also see in the way that we in our work, is that it's a lot of people want to engage more in interdisciplinary and transformative science, but sometimes the institutions that host us are not necessarily the most.
I have the feeling that Colin the line is not working. The Wi-Fi does not work well, probably. Can you hear Colin on your side?
No, it's cut out.
Yeah, sorry about that. Maybe Rosie, you can.
Well, maybe we can, once Colin's back, she can maybe finish, but we can go to maybe Rebecca's question.
Yes, thank you. I do have a second question, which relates very much to what Colleen just said. So I personally have a environmental science and political science background and ended up at law school, so I could very much relate to what you were just saying. But given the fact that I am now at law school, I spend a lot of time thinking about the role of the law and how it facilitates or inhibits the kind of transformations that you were talking about. And I saw on Christina's slide that you do have a lawyer in your team. So I was thinking if you could talk a bit about the way you view the role of the law as an institution, but also law and policy making, because after all, law is being made by people in the work that you do.
Yes, of course. Thank you, Rebecca. So the way we see metabolism, I'm a student of a person that I think promotes a very interesting view on metabolism, who is called Mario Giampietro. And the way in which we learned about metabolism was that the metabolism, it's a property of living systems. So you cannot have more metabolism or less metabolism. You can have more material use or less material use, but metabolism is like you cannot have more or less life, so to say, no? And as such, you need a certain set of rules to organize those flows. And that set of rules very often is formally put in the way of laws. And then understanding how this process is done formally, it's different from policies, right? So the laws are closer to the beliefs of the people, what is right, what is wrong, and how life should be managed. So the work Maria, who's the lawyer in our team, is actually doing is related to that, to the way in which so remember that I mentioned before that we are very interested in the way on how models are thought of before. So how narratives actually influenced the way we model, we create the models that they later on ended up in a computer model and a set of functions. But there is a whole semantic process before that happens that is very heavily influenced by that, and we take that into account. So she is the one helping with that part of the assessment, and she is the one focusing on how institutions, which I understand in the way that Arie Varnon and Elinor Ostrom define them, how institutions are formalized into laws and how they affect our models. So, but that gives for a whole complete session of the forum. Feel free to reach out. I mean, we can put you in contact with Maria if you like and discuss this.
Thank you.
So I think my connection got cut off while I was speaking, but I see another question was asked. Are there any more questions from the audience or comments? Anything you would like to share? Or any last words maybe from Christina, Sabine, or Juan? Otherwise, I would give the floor back to Rosie. But if you have anything you still want to add, now's the time.
No, maybe just thank you for the organization and that this is a very, very nice initiative.
Thank you.
The same for myself. Thank you very much for the invitation, and it's been really nice to share the seminar with Christina, Sabine, and all of you. Thank you.
Same for me. Thank you very much for your organization, always impeccable. If we say this in English.
Thank you. Then I will give the floor back to Rosie. Voilà. Thanks.
Rosie is frozen, so maybe you can close.
It seems like we have connection issues in this office. Yeah, well then I'm just going to be closing. Thank you all for joining, and thank you for your questions. Thank you, of course, Christina, Sabine, and Juan for your insights. So for those of you who maybe don't know us yet, we're the Pathways Initiative. Catherine is sending the links in the chat where you can find out more about us. And we host these meetings, these forums on a bi-monthly basis, and they're on different topics every time. And if I'm not mistaken, the next forum will be on socio-ecological transitions. And if you want to know more about it, you can subscribe to our newsletter, which is coming. The next one is coming out very soon, and you will be able to know more about the next forum and all of the other activities that we do. So I think that being said, maybe I see Rosie's back. Maybe she wants to say any last words.
Yeah, sorry, I think our internet is not doing very well, but from what I heard, I think Claudine said it all, and we can't wait to see you in the next forum in December.
Goodbye.
Goodbye, everybody.